full-time jobs. Should I go the other way? Full-time jobs. One more time. Hey there, I'm Elise and welcome back to my channel. So at long last, we finally made it to part 3 of how to get a job in Korea, full-time jobs. Getting a job anywhere in the world these days is tough, especially during a pandemic, but Korea is on a whole nother level. I'm not gonna lie to you, I hate it. There are too many interview rounds, too many rules, and too many people after the same position. The competition is fierce. But I'm going to attempt to summarize everything you need to know if you want to pursue a full-time career here in Korea. Although I don't like the interview process and the job hunting process here, I have gone through the whole process a few times and come out on the other side, so it can be done. You can do it too, and I'm going to tell you how. But before we get into it, don't forget to subscribe and follow me on Instagram for more advice, stories, and peeks into my real life in Korea. If you haven't had a chance to check out my previous videos on job hunting in Korea, I highly recommend you check those out because each video kind of builds up on the other. In each video, I shared different job seeking resources, and I also talked about different aspects of the job market here in Korea. So if you watch all 3, you'll really have a big picture of what it's like here, and you'll be able to make the perfect strategy for you. In just one video, I'm probably not going to be able to go into every specific detail of getting a full-time job in Korea, but this time what I'm going to talk about is what you should prepare for the job interviews, what you can expect during the job interview process overall, and what you should be looking for in a full-time job. All right, let's get real. As usual, I've got to start with, can you legally work a full-time job in Korea? It's the question of the century that everyone just seems to gloss over when it comes to wanting to get a full-time job. You need to know if you can even do it without, getting deported. Of course, if you're a Korean citizen, then question answered, you are ready to go. You can get a full-time job. If you're not a Korean citizen, you need a visa that allows full-time work. That would be an E visa or an F visa. And mainly what you need to know about the difference between these two is for an E visa, you need a sponsor, and for an F visa, you don't need a sponsor. In simple terms, if you have an E visa and you have a sponsor, if you quit your job, your visa is canceled and you're screwed. If you have an F visa and you quit your job, then you can freely find a new job or maybe do some freelance work. It depends on your visa, but you're not as restricted as if you have an E visa. The only thing to worry about with an F visa is if you can qualify again when it's time to renew it. There are other visas that allow full-time work, but those are very specific to the type of full-time work. I don't know all the specific visas that there are, so if you have a question about visas, I highly recommend that you call immigration. Sorry, I don't know. If you want to ask in the comments, maybe I can answer your question, but it would be much safer and you'd be getting a much more accurate and detailed answer if you call immigration. We're gonna keep it moving along. Now, assuming that you have a visa or can get a visa that allows you to work in Korea, now you need to start preparing to apply for jobs. And to do that, you're going to need what is the Korean equivalent of a resume called 이력서 and the Korean equivalent of a cover letter called 자기소개서. These are quite different from the American style of the documents, to be honest. I've seen resumes and cover letters from other countries as well. I'd say that they're quite different from several other countries, so let's compare. So the Korean resume is much more straightforward, in my opinion, than the American resume. It's more like a form. So a lot of people just download it and fill it out rather than draft something from scratch on their own. The downside of this compared to an American resume is that there's not a lot of room to distract the employer with flowery. There's not a lot of room to distract the employer with fluffy language or a colorful template design. You attach your photo and then you fill out the details one by one, your education, your work history, your activities and awards, and you have to show the certificates. You have to show the proof of each thing that you're saying. Otherwise, for all they know, you're making it up. But anyway, the way that it presents to me is very dry. Let's go back to that certificate point. So let's say that you think that you are very fluent or proficient in Korean. If you don't have a certificate or some kind of test score to put on your resume, it's very possible that the employer will just disregard this point. Even though you could prove it during an interview, because you don't have that certificate, cancel. Like it didn't happen. It doesn't exist. You don't have that skill. Of course, this is not always the case. Of course, there are sometimes exceptions, but from my experience and also from what I've heard from my friends, Korea very highly values certificates. So you need to make sure that you have some kind of evidence that you can do the thing that you said you can do. I'm not saying don't write it on your resume. You can write everything on your resume that you think is a reflection of your skills and the things that you can bring to the company. But don't expect that the company is going to believe everything that you wrote. I'll include a link in the description down below of resume templates that I think that you could use. I also plan to make a video specifically on how to write a Korean resume, but today it's just the overview, so I'm going to move on to the second document, which is a 자기소개서. And I said before that this is the Korean equivalent of a cover letter. It translates more closely to a self-introduction letter. It's not really a letter to address the employer. It's more of a letter that describes you. So usually it will have sections on what are your strengths and weaknesses, what in life prepared you for this position, and also something about your family background and family values. But I've heard that nowadays people are kind of foregoing the family part. That's getting kind of outdated, and it's considered kind of discriminatory to consider you based on something related to your family. Also, some employers will give their own questions that they want you to answer in the 자기소개서, so the actual sections that are included might change. The hard part is you're expected to tailor your 자기소개서 to the employer no matter what the questions are. It's basically a series of essay questions that aren't specifically about the company, but the way that you answer has to be specified to the company. Now for me, since I'm not a native Korean speaker, and tailoring each cover letter to each employer would take me three times as long as a native speaker, I didn't really tailor mine to the employer. I turned in essentially the same cover letter, just changing a few sentences and obviously the position that I was applying for. Just a few things here and there so that I could get the application in on time. I considered my 자기소개서 to be more of a piece of evidence that I have a high level of Korean rather than me trying to write to each company that they should pick me. That was my strategy. Of course, if I had done it even more tailored to the company, maybe I would have gotten more callbacks. I don't know, but you do what you want to do. So now you might be wondering, do I have to give the resume in Korean? Do I have to give the cover letter in Korean? Or can I just give my English documents or whatever language? I mean, no, you probably shouldn't do it in another language. But anyway, some companies will specify that you only need a Korean version or you only need an English version. But if the application allowed for me to attach multiple documents, I always attached both because I wanted to be able to prove that not only am I a native English speaker, but I have a high proficiency in Korean, which can be useful to your company. I said earlier that the competition is fierce. There are more and more foreigners coming to Korea these days, so even the competition amongst us is very fierce. And depending on the job that you're applying for, you might also be competing with native Koreans as well. So you need to be able to show that you are proficient in both and that you have a high level in both, maybe a higher level than the other people who applied for the job. I think it is a highly outdated thought that in 2022 you can come to Korea without speaking any Korean and just get a full-time job. It happens, it's possible, but it's getting less and less likely as time goes by, as more people come here. So if I were you, I would prepare both. And if you're not going to prepare both, I would prepare the Korean one, not the English one. Next, once you've gotten your documents in order, you're ready to start applying. As far as where to go to find a full-time job, I've already shared the resources in videos 1 and 2. All of the resources that I gave have options for part-time jobs, internships, and full-time jobs. They aren't specified to any one specific type of position. Even the part-time job apps like Albamon that I mentioned in the part-time job video have full-time jobs also. What I didn't share in my previous videos is how to tell if the job is right for you. I'm sure you'll be wondering things like, what is the salary? What is the work environment like? Will I be expected to work overtime, go to a lot of 회식, kiss the butt of my superiors, and all the kind of things that people dread about working in a Korean company? You can find the answer to these questions on apps like Job Planet, and Blind. These are basically the Korean equivalent of Glassdoor. So you can see the stats, you can see the employee reviews, you can see some interview questions that people were asked during the interview round, and etc. If you want to be able to see all these details in full, you're going to have to make a membership, or you have to give a review to see the company's details. So it's like a trade. If you're very serious about getting a job in Korea, I would recommend getting a membership. I got a membership for Job Planet, and it was very helpful for me during my job hunting process to be able to see all the details and quickly eliminate ones that I knew I could not work in, I could not deal with. Now, you'll have to make your own standards. You'll have to decide what your, deal breakers are for getting a job and then judge based on that. I can't tell you what you should and shouldn't look for when you're applying for jobs. That's completely up to you. Let me give you an example. So the worst review for the company that I'm currently working in is that the snacks, there was not enough variety of the snacks. And because of the snack variety, out of 5 stars, they gave the company 3 stars. Another low review mentioned that they didn't like to communicate with foreigners because it was 불편해. It was inconvenient. It was like a hassle for them to have to communicate with people who couldn't speak Korean, which is stupid because the nature of the company is all globalization. Of course, at some point you have to talk to foreigners. But anyway, in my case, I don't care about the snacks. I'm just grateful that you're giving me any snacks at all, and I wouldn't give any review based on the snacks. And as far as the communication thing, this doesn't affect me. This doesn't change whether I want to work for the company or not, because I personally can communicate with someone. I think those people who find it inconvenient to do so, they're the ones that shouldn't have worked in the company, not me. And I think those people have already left the company. I've never met anyone like that, or if I have, they've been keeping it a secret, so I don't care. By my standards, I could disregard this feedback. To other people, what snacks the company has available might be very important, and they might not want to work with anybody who finds it inconvenient to communicate with foreigners. So you decide what's right for you. Meanwhile, there were reviews for other companies that I did take very seriously, and I decided I don't think I can work here. Those things would include lots of overtime, abuse of power, lack of leadership, things like that. In that case, if I saw many reviews with people mentioning those things over and over and over, then I eliminated that company as one that I wanted to apply to. So don't just feel like you have to impress the employer. They also have to impress you. And you can see if they've impressed the people who are already working there, and if they haven't, then maybe you don't want to work there. If it's your first job ever, then maybe you don't want to be too picky. Maybe you have to take what you can get and work there for a short period of time, and then you go on to work somewhere else. So those are the kind of things that you can consider also when you're applying for a full-time job, and also when you're looking at these reviews. But you need to decide what you can accept and what you can't accept. These apps also show scores. I haven't used Blind that much, but on Job Planet, it's out of 5 stars. But the thing that you have to be careful about is that companies have their HR departments. Okay, I should not, accuse anybody. It is speculated that companies have their HR departments writing fake reviews or having people write fake reviews so that their star rating should go up. So in general, people say that you should aim for a company that has a 3 or higher. But just because they have a 3 or higher doesn't mean that you can trust their 3, because the companies and the HR departments know this too. I am aware of one company that is 100% faking their reviews. So just take their score with a grain of salt. Rather than focus on the star rating, I think that you should just scroll through as many negative reviews as possible and see what are the negative things that people are writing, so you can see if those things are also negative in your opinion. Last but not least, let's talk about the interviews. If you have your visa situation figured out and you have your documents prepared, at this point, you've pretty much just walked up to the starting point of the race. You have not even started the race yet. To be honest, you might not even be at the interview round yet. A lot of companies, after accepting your documents and after deciding that you passed this round, will then give you a written test round. The type of test will vary depending on the company. Some of them do personality tests, some of them do logic tests, some of them do both. Some even have written assignments or presentations that you'll have to give during the interview. There are even study materials to prepare for these tests depending on which company you want to work for. This is of course only for big companies like Samsung, LG, etc. But the fact that you have to study for an interview is like incredible to me, but it is very common here. I even had to study and ask someone for help to prepare for a personality test. And if I knew that any company was giving a logic test, I just automatically didn't apply for those companies because I'm illogical. So just know that the road ahead might be very long and that everything that you've done to this point was just for you to get started. The fewest number of interview rounds that I've ever experienced was 2, and the most that I've ever heard of is 7. The most that I personally experienced was 4. And about the structure of the interview, Korea likes things pali-pali. So you don't have time for a one-on-one interview, especially not at the beginning round when there's still hundreds of applicants that they have to go through depending on the size of the company. So you will be doing group interviews most likely. It's usually 3 or more interviewees against 2 or more interviewers. So they'll be asking all of you different questions, or they might be asking you all the same questions, which makes it hard because you have to be giving different answers to the people that are around you, and you need to be trying to give better answers than them. In some cases, the interviewers will also ask you what you think about what the previous interviewee just answered. So you also have to be listening to what their answers were so that you can give a response if put in that situation. And this group interview structure will likely proceed up until the very last round of the interview. I have gotten to the final round of an interview and it was me versus the person that they were considering instead of me. So just don't expect to be interviewed on your own unless maybe the company is smaller or they didn't get a lot of applications. Maybe the position is very specific, so there's not a lot of people who match the position and you happen to be a match. Then maybe you'll have a one-on-one interview. But most of the time, especially if it's your first job, if you're applying as shinip, then it won't be one-on-one. They don't have time for you, they don't care about you. So the company will usually send instructions once they've told you that you've made it to the interview round. So make sure that you read this carefully. They will tell you the dress code, they'll tell you what time you need to be there, where you need to be, etc., etc. And in most cases, you can't really control this. So if you're not available on that day or that time, then you just drop out of the interview. You have to be available when they say that you have to be available. And as far as that dress code thing, this is not the time to be original. This is not the time to decide that you're going to impress somebody with the way that you dressed or that you don't care what they said that you should be wearing. I have seen people who went to an interview and the interview directions said specifically that you need to wear casual dress, don't wear a suit. Somebody showed up in a suit, and so then the interviewer asked, like, could you not read the instructions, or did you not care what we said in the instructions? And that was embarrassing. So make sure that you read what it says, otherwise you look bad. Don't think for yourself at this point. Do what they said. Now the interview questions. I won't go into each specific question and my recommended answers in this video. That needs a whole video on its own too. But just know that in Korea, it's much more common for people to memorize their answers before going into the interview. So for the first time in my life, once I came to Korea, I had to actually type up my answers to very common interview questions or interview questions that I heard that this company gives and memorize my answers. Now, my attitude was I shouldn't recite something because then they're going to know that I memorized this and it sounds very unnatural. So my strategy was to memorize these answers, but then be able to kind of ad-lib them if I wasn't saying exactly what I had written, because of course you're going to be so nervous during an interview. How are you going to be able to say it exactly as you wrote it on the paper? I started to run out of breath. So my tip to you is know your answers very thoroughly to the point where once you start answering, if you go off track, you can bring yourself back on track. So in upcoming videos that I plan to make on this topic, I'll probably no longer be labeling them part 1, part 2, part 3, whatever, but I will talk about how to write the resume and cover letter, what kind of interview questions you can expect, and also what kind of tests that will be given during the test portion, like the personality test and the logic test, etc. I can't tell you how to answer the logic test because, again, I am illogical. But I can tell you the questions and where you can find the resources for these tests. Okay, So I hope that I've given you enough insights on how the overall process works in terms of job hunting in Korea. Again, I recommend that you check out my other videos, part 1 and part 2 on job hunting in Korea, so that you can get the overall picture and you can build a foolproof strategy for you. I'll be leaving several links in the description box down below that I think will be helpful and related to the topics that I covered in this video. But of course, if you have any more questions or if there's anything else that you'd like to know about living in Korea, please leave a comment down below. I'll also be sharing specifically on how the job seeking experience was for me. There were some ups and some downs, some highlights and some darkness. So make sure you subscribe and don't forget to hit that bell so that you don't miss out on my next videos. Thanks for watching. 다음에 봐요. Bye!